Hi everyone, Mike Deegan, Central Manchester.
Brendan Ryan, South Manchester.
Hi, Chris Harrison, Medical Director of the Christie, but I'm sitting on the stage as the newly appointed domain lead for the MAHSC Cancer Summit.
Dalton, Chief Executive at Salford Royal.
Hi, Caroline Shaw, Chief Executive of the Christie.
Leila Williams, NHS Greater Manchester.
Raj Patel, wearing a couple of hats, GP, Chair of a clinical commissioning group in Tameside and Glossop, and Medical Director for NHS Greater Manchester.
Ian Wilkinson, our GP, and the Chief Clinical Officer for NHS Oldham CCG.
I'm Mike Burrows, the Chief Executive of NHS Greater Manchester. From the 1st of April next year, I'll be the local area team director of the local office of the NHS Commissioning
Tony Brown, I'm a colorectal surgeon in Wigan and Medical Director of the Cancer Network.
I'll stay sitting down everyone because if I stand up I'm worried I'll fall off this stage because there's so many of us up here. In the last session just before lunch, we were all on the same table and we thought the particular area that we could focus on was how we could make operational and effective a new Greater Manchester Provider Cancer Board. So what we'd just like to share some of the headlines around how we think that board could be set up and how it could operate. But if I can say really just to preface that work, Julie, you do get a real sense there's a power in this room today. And you do see a way, because I was down at 8 or 9 at this end when we were standing around the back. The last day or two has really moved me further along, and I think we're now within touching distance of making a lot of this happen. Okay, so we'll talk about the Provider Cancer Board and how we think this could operate. To begin with, we felt it was really important that we establish a new board. The existing network arrangements have really stood us in good stead in the past, but we feel we're now at a critical juncture where we need to establish a new provider board. I'm conscious of discussions with Mike, there'll probably be some complementary commissioning arrangements, but we're just talking about how we work together as providers. We also wanted to make sure that the new cancer board was the single focus for providers around cancer. There is currently, as Chris has said, a domain under the MAHSC, the Manchester Academic Health Science Centre. That links formally to the Academic Health Science Network. But what we'll present to you today, we feel, is the single cohering board around cancer care. We also recognise that we need to agree a strong and inclusive membership to that board. We don't wish to go through in detail today exactly how that will be made up. That's a level of detail. But we recognise that stakeholders from all across the spectrum would need to play into this. What would be different? How could we ensure that we learn the lessons from the past? Well, I guess the first major starting point, we all recognise, as providers of cancer care, we need really strong commissioning arrangements. So step one, for all the tumour-specific groups or all the pathways, as a cancer board, we will receive a single Greater Manchester-wide commission. Yeah? That's really quite different from where we've been in the past. Once that commission's been received, so we could be talking about upper GI, gynae cancer, any particular area, as a group of providers, we then need to work out, ideally, an alliance, a single provider response, or there may be several alliance responses that would come forward. And that very much builds on the work that our commissioning colleagues have been looking at about creating prime vendor arrangements. So there'd be one set of leadership for each individual pathway. We also recognised we had to address the challenge that Mike and Tony repeated in our session, is how do we make sure we don't get logjammed like we have in the past on a particular pathway or particular area. To ensure that doesn't happen in the future, we're all very keen and are prepared to sign up to some binding internal governance arrangements within the Cancer Board. So if we're ever in a position where there are two competing collaborating bids, that we have a mechanism within that board through receiving independent clinical and patient advice as to what would be the preferred way forward. That recommendation would then go back to commissioners. All of us wholeheartedly support the view that we need to sign up to those arrangements, and once a decision had been made, there'd be no further challenge out with this process. So a decision's made, it's on to implementation, not arguing with the decision. We were also very clear that taking the momentum from the last few days, we need to ensure that a provider cancer board wasn't just about IOG compliance. Clearly that's important as a baseline. But there's a huge body of work that we need to get into beyond IOG compliance, so we can ensure across Greater Manchester we are, whether it's internationally competitive, global best, whatever phrase we use, there's an awful lot more that's come out over the last few days which is above the baseline of compliance. So we recognised we needed to end up with a really quite inclusive work programme, not just around clinical care, around our teaching and training responsibilities, critically how we utilise our collective power to drive translational research around cancer, and for all that to come under the auspices of our provider board. A really important point that came up from several colleagues was this couldn't just be a replica of what's happened in the past, and we would need to spend time establishing a new MO or a new way of working. And whilst that will be difficult, there are other areas that we're all involved in. And one good example around trauma care, where we've found a way over the last 12 months or so to move away from institutional or strongly held views from individual clinicians to get more onto some common collaborative ground. So that was a broad thrust of what we've all signed up to. In terms of the immediate next steps, we were conscious we didn't want to lose the pace and the energy that's come from this two-day event. We all signed up to authorising Chris Harrison to lead on our collective behalf on developing the provider board. As Chris said earlier, he's already the MAHSC cancer domain lead. So rather than have duplicated structures, let's just go for one streamlined set of arrangements. We will all work with Chris, so we'll bring a paper back to all our respective boards of directors by the 1st of December 2012, i.e. this year, capturing this revised approach. And our collective aspiration was to be fully operational by 2013. And that, again, reflects David's earlier form of words around where we need to be by that date. So to be clear, if there was an area that wasn't IOG compliant, we'd have an agreed plan and we'd have a timeline. The specific areas that we need to get focused on in the short term, so there's no confusion, is around gynae, HPB, upper GI, urology, and the work around acute oncology that Mike Richards and the national team flagged up to us yesterday afternoon. So Julie, that's how we've tried to construct a cancer board operating. We know there's a rich diversity of other areas that have been covered, but we felt this was the part where we could collectively make a difference.
Okay. And the other question I think I had for you was, do any of you have anything else to say in response to where people were standing and how people were feeling in the last session? Because that's kind of like new data from what you planned to say. Raj?
Right. As a CCG chair and representative of the 12 CCGs in Greater Manchester, I think we've been through quite a steep development learning curve over the last year. And I'm really pleased to tell you that the 12 CCGs are all going through their authorisation processes over the next few months. We, as new commissioners, quite frankly, were very, very unhappy with the system that we inherited. And in a sense, we're quite outraged in the way that you heard some of that outrage yesterday and today. And a few months ago, many of us were saying, well, hold on, we are developing locally and working for our local populations, and I know you will have your own individual relationships with your local CCG. But collectively, we felt that there was something much more ambitious that we could do. And where it's appropriate to commission services locally, then certainly each CCG is committed to do so. But where it really matters for our greater population of Greater Manchester, and to take a single issue such as cancer, we are absolutely committed that we want to act as one voice, one commission, Mike, as you suggested and as you requested. And if we have been weak on clarifying what our commissioning intention was in the past, then we want to be very, very clear that we give you our deliberate desire to achieve better outcomes. And that's beyond the improving outcomes guidance. This reflects a conversation that the CCG chairs had just a couple of months ago, where we got to a hair's breadth of pressing the nuclear button to say, let's just introduce sanctions, let's just introduce some penalties, let's put in contractual leaders immediately. We thought that was the wrong thing to do, given that this summit was just around the corner. And we really wanted this summit so the leaders could have an opportunity of understanding that we are the only ones in the system, as Leila says, there isn't another route. And to be sure that as leaders we do start pointing in the same direction. We observed a number of clinical conversations that happened. The clinicians said, well, hold on, often the clinicians can just about get to an agreement, but just as the clinicians get to a clinical agreement, somewhere along the line, either relationships get in the way, or organisational boundaries get in the way. And what you've reported, Mike, as creating this provider coalition, I think to us seems a really good way forward, because that should unlock some of those clinical tensions. But beyond that, I think Leila used the words earlier about compromise and fudge. And I think as clinical commissioners, we are holding the purse strings, and quite frankly, we don't want compromise and fudge. We genuinely want better outcomes. And if those better outcomes can't be achieved together, then we're prepared to be much bolder with the way that we exercise procurement, whether it be collaborative procurement or it is actually competitive procurement. And ultimately, I think we have got a bold new role in front of us, and the CCGs for Greater Manchester have also acknowledged that the current system, with its multiple providers that we commission with multiple commissioners, also doesn't work very well. And to that end, we've certainly put all our energy and our force behind the Healthier Together programme, and we really, really want this particular work on cancer maybe to be the forerunner and really guide where we end up with Healthier Together in the long run.
Anyone else? Dave?
Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps address these comments to those people who were on my left-hand side of the wall. So those people who were sceptical, and for those people who weren't positioning themselves, but also had a legitimate scepticism about the things that we're talking about now. And I think it is to recognise that what's happened so far is completely understandable, that organisations have looked to protect their own interests and to develop their own ambitions. That is the way that things are, and that's the way that things will continue, because if there is a game to play, people will wish to play the game. I think what we're talking about now, though, is that there's a different game and there are different rules. And I think that for those people sceptical, the judgment that you'll have to make is whether you sense that this really is a different game and there are different rules that are going to be played by. I just want to emphasise the points that Mike was making. That in the past, institutions have looked to serve their own ends and to serve the people they have a responsibility for. And the game changer here is that the responsibility now shifts to the whole of the population of the network. And I think that is a game changer. That if there is a single commission for a pathway, that has to cover the whole of the network. And then the requirement is for providers to find their way of coming together to work in partnership to deliver against that single commission, rather than there being separate interests pursued with separate contracts between the commissioner and individual organisations. So it is fundamentally different what's being proposed. I also think then having a single integrated board with a mechanism that will have a binding agreement on the parties represented at that board is also very different from what we've had in the past. So, new game, new rules. I think for those who are sceptical, your judgment will be made on whether we transact those in the time period that Mike has outlined.
I guess if I was a secondary or a tertiary care provider out there, I'd be asking the question now, what about those providers, of which there are upward of 500 in Greater Manchester, are primary care providers? We've heard a lot over these past 2 days about early diagnosis, etc. And we really haven't heard a lot about primary care's contribution here. And it's really just to reassure people that one of the remits we have as CCGs is to actually improve the quality of primary care. And that's something we take and are taking extremely seriously. So we do see that as providers of primary care services, we do have a role and do have a fit within all this. We're all going through an authorisation process at the moment, as Raj alluded to. And within that, one of the things that we have a legal duty to do is to innovate. And now I see this as innovation, absolutely. And if CCGs are going to be successful in moving forward, we will have to fulfil that duty, and perhaps people out there can make sure they actually hold us to account in doing that. I think one of the other things very quickly we haven't mentioned was the fact that we're not just Greater Manchester, we are actually Greater Manchester and East Cheshire, and we do have the East Cheshire CCG on board as well.
Chris, have you got the mic because you're going to say something?
Yes, I have. So I was going to say that I'm delighted to take up the challenge that's been set me by the Chief Executive. I have to say, I agree with, I'm not quite sure who it was, but somebody in about the 7 or 8 category said that it can be made to work elsewhere. And I believe that it can be made to work in Greater Manchester. I was right up at the top in 10. A couple of things just to say that I think we can learn from and be better than the experience that I've had over the last 2 years in London. I think we've got the opportunity to do things better than that. There are 3 principles, though, that I think need to be adhered to. Firstly, these things need to be clinically led. I've had that reiterated to me time and time again. We've got some brilliant and fantastic clinicians in the room. They need to be, I'm trying not to use the word empowered, but they need to be given the authority to get on and, as they have been doing, make some of these changes. The second is the balance between commissioning systems and providing systems. If those 2 bits of the system, if it's out of kilter, it doesn't work. So I'm really pleased to hear the things that have been said by Raj and Ian and Mike and others about the determination to think differently about the way that commissioning takes place for cancer, as well as balancing the approach described by the Chief Executive for the provider side of the system. I think the 2 go hand in hand if we're going to achieve the best outcomes. And the third thing I've just forgotten. And the third thing is the pathway commissioning, or the pathway issue. It's not easy, and you get into all sorts of conversations about the primary care, early diagnostic end of things, and all sorts of conversations about the other end of the pathway, end of life. But it's absolutely, in my view, it's absolutely essential. Well, all those things in between. The whole from the whole spectrum. And in my view, that's absolutely essential that we do take that whole pathway view, not just in our thinking and organising, but backed up by our commissioning and our financial mechanisms and incentives. So those 3 things I think I would see as being essential to making this work.
I just want to come back to the issue of the cynicism that was in the room. Certainly there's probably a lot of that yesterday, but it was still apparent today. And that's not surprising given the amount of time that we've expended in not resolving some of the issues. I think what we've got here is a game changer. It absolutely will be a game changer for us. I think there's been a mandate created within this room over the 2 days, which will make it very difficult for people sat up here to ignore it and go back from what we've committed to, albeit only verbally at the moment. So you guys out there have got to hold us as the leaders to account now to deliver these new arrangements, because these arrangements will resolve the issues that we've been struggling with for so long. Tony and I were just discussing, we are already aware of some of the conversations that have occurred within groups in the room. We do tend to suggest that in terms of some of the areas that you've highlighted, Mike, there will be suggestions coming forward to that governance arrangement very rapidly. So it should enable us to make some really rapid progress on a couple of those areas. So I remain the optimist.
Anybody in the room want to comment, ask a question, join in this conversation?
The problem is that motherhood and apple pie always comes out when you get consensus. And one of the things that was alarming about what Mike Richards showed us is our inability to meet the national standards in terms of mortality and issues. And he showed us clearly the results from various units around the place in North West. And what we really need is open and transparent publication of those results, because naming and shaming, whilst it's unfortunate, the only way people move, we've learned from audit in medicine, is if you actually identify areas of good practice and give them brownie points, whatever, and you identify areas where you need to change. And if we just carry on without being open and transparent about it, we'll not move forward. The only way we'll get to best in class is we actually have targets to aim at across the network in all of the CSGs.
I'll just say a few words from a commissioner perspective on that, because I think the arrangements that we're describing here from the provider perspective and mirrored by the commissioner perspective should enable us to very radically simplify the commissioning arrangements that exist at the moment, to make sure it is about standards and outcomes and a pathway of improvement, rather than getting bogged down in some of the details I suspect that we've been bogged down in today. So I think we can meet those aspirations by making sure that becomes the primary driver for our new commissioning arrangements, rather than perhaps some of the more input areas that we've focused on today.
I agree with that. That's the reason for talking about pathways in the way that was described.
Talk amongst yourselves, people, and then they'll just shout me if they want to join in.
I'll just say a few words to my clinical colleagues. For the last year, I've chaired the head and neck subgroup. A long story about that, which we don't go into, but at the last head and neck group, one of the senior surgeons announced to the group that they were planning to have discussions about setting up a single-site integrated head and neck service. It's not being commissioner-driven, commissioner-led. This was the clinicians that were delivering the care. And I think that is a sign of a process of working together that could take our network beyond IOG. Head and neck doesn't need to reconfigure, but if it did, we would have one of the largest units in the country with superb research opportunities, training opportunities. So what I would say to our other clinicians is to think about that, and if you're working in a non-IOG compliant unit, or even an IOG compliant unit that could be improved, we ought to be discussing how we could take things forward as clinicians with our colleagues, not just in our own organisation, but in other organisations, and then come back to this new board and to the commissioners to help in how that can be achieved.